Well, I was going to assign, well, I am going to assign this week to one of the classes, viewing the simple past tense, the video I did with simple past tense of regular and irregular verbs. And I watched it before deciding to assign it and thought, oh my goodness, I left out some pretty important things. One of the things I left out is it's not just regular and irregular verbs. Well, that is the main thing actually I left out. And there is such a thing called a mixed verb. A mixed verb has features of both regular and irregular. You notice, if you remember the present perfect tense, the past participles of regular verbs end in T. Spielen, gespielt. Machen, gemacht, tanzen, getanzt, right? The stem vowel doesn't change and the participle ends in T. Irregular verbs, participle ends in N, usually EN, and you normally will get a stem vowel change. Gehen, gegangen, schwimmen, geschwommen. Okay. Sometimes you just don't get the stem vowel change, like essen, gegessen. But they're always going to end in N or really EN. And so I gave the presentation on the simple past tense of those irregular verbs, es and as, for example, ich aß or ich war. And then the regular verbs, ich machte. I mean, it's real simple stuff. But there's this group of verbs called mixed verbs. And they're called mixed verbs because one foot is in the regular column and another foot is in the irregular column. They undergo a stem. First of all, the participle ends in T. The past participle ends in T, but it undergoes a stem vowel change. Okay, it's one feature of each type of verb. And in the simple past tense, the stem vowel undergoes a change, which you would say an irregular verb, but the past participle, the endings are the same. It gets endings as a regular verb. T-E, T-E-S-T, T-E, T-E-N. The list of these verbs is, you can't count them on one hand. It's longer than that. Some of the common ones are rennen, rannte, gerannt. So rennen and rannte is the past tense, not rente. Okay, and not ran, as you might expect, but rannte. Rennen, rannte, gerannt. Kennen, kannte, gekannt. Brennen, brannte, gebrannt. And there's a number of them. But I wrote two of them. Possibly the most common ones. I don't know. I would think so, just so you see that. So wissen, wusste, gewusst. The past tense of wissen is wusste. And so in a sentence you might say, das wusste ich. I knew that. Das wusste ich. Wusste das auch. He also knew that. Right? He gets those same endings. T-E, T-E-S-T, T-E, T-E-N, T-E-T, T-E-N. But there's that stem vowel change. The I became a U. Another very, very common one is denken, to think. Denken, dachte, gedacht. Ja, das dachte ich. That's what I thought. Yeah? So, those are mixed verbs, an important part of any presentation of simple past tense of verbs. And while I'm at it here, and rather than make a separate video for this topic, the simple past tense of modal verbs. And they're pretty straightforward. They look, for the most part, there's an exception, for the most part they look like the infinitives. First of all, let's review the modals. Mögen, wollen, sollen, können, dürfen, and müssen. Now, sollen and wollen don't get umlauts. All the others have an umlaut. None of the and in a sense, they are a little bit like sollen and wollen work just like regular verbs. Ich sollte, du solltest, sollte. Wir sollten, ihr solltet, sie sollten. Okay? And wollen, the same thing. Wollte, wollte, wolltest, wollte. By the way, these modal verbs, using them in the past as opposed to the present perfect, which I will make a separate presentation on, is pretty common. You do use that. Ich wollte nicht gehen. I didn't want to go. It's much simpler than the present perfect tense. And so even in speech and in conversation, there's a tendency more than just a tendency. It's more frequent to hear the simple past tense used as opposed to the present perfect. Ich habe gehen wollen would be the equivalent of ich wollte gehen. So sollen and wollen work just like regular verbs. Sollte, wollte. Müssen, können, and dürfen are just like the infinitives, except the umlaut is dropped. So you have musste, konnte, durfte. Same as the infinitive, drop the umlaut and put the weak endings on, the regular verb endings, te, test, te. And mögen is the one that's the biggest exception. It too changes, no umlaut, gets the regular weak endings, te, test, te, but instead of mochte, or however mochte, that was pretty hard to say, mögen without the umlaut, it's mochte. That might look familiar to you because you've learned the verb möchten, would like. Well, the reality is, would like is just really a subjunctive form of the verb mochten, or the past tense form of the verb mögen, and these subjunctives are built on the past tense. You could look at the video on subjunctives and how they're built on the past tense. So that is the past tense of the verb mögen. Ich mochte ihn nicht. I didn't like him. Alright? The thing to remember, none of them get an umlaut. You put umlauts on them and you make them subjunctive. Sollen and wollen won't get an umlaut in the subjunctive, but the others will, and it completely, it's interestingly enough, they'll translate the exact same way into English. They will both translate the same way. Könnte would translate as could. Konnte translates as could, but they mean something completely different. And even though they have the same translation in English, but that's a different topic, that's subjunctive. So, this is the simple past tense of modal verbs. It's important to know these because in speech, as well as in the written form, they tend to get used more than the present perfect tense. Normal second element position, infinitive at the end. Ich sollte mit ihm gehen. Ich musste zu Hause bleiben. I had to stay home. So that should do it from here on my front porch. The simple past tense of modal verbs and of mixed verbs. Ta-ta.